Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Need to get a motion to go into the 21st special session.
So moved, Mayor.
Second.
Thank you. Discussion.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we're in special session. Approval of resolution, acceptance of offer of quitclaim for a parcel from the Herald Mail Company.
Mr. Mayor, I move for mayor and council approval of a resolution to accept the offer of quitclaim parcel from the Herald Mail Company for the purposes of confirming and extending the area previously quitclaimed and otherwise conveyed to the city.
And I'll second it.
Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 4-0. Approval of resolution, accept the offer of quitclaim parcel from Antietam Paper Building LLC.
Mr. Mayor, I hereby move for mayor and council approval of a resolution to accept the offer of a quitclaim parcel from Antietam Paper Building LLC for the purposes of confirming and extending the area previously quitclaimed and otherwise conveyed to the city.
Second.
Discussion.
Just think again, Mayor, we need to thank both of these folks for their contribution to cultural trail. Without it, we couldn't do it.
Yeah. Anybody else? All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0. All right, come out of special session and go into the work session. First issue is land management code amendments, automobile repair in IMU zoning district, and abandonment of simplified plats to subdivide existing townhouse units. Stephen Bachman.
Good afternoon. We have two pending text amendments to the Land Management Code, which are going to be scheduled for a public hearing later this month. And we're here today to just explain them to you, see if you have any questions before we move forward. The first one is relatively simple. This is actually a public generated amendment. We very rarely ever get citizens actually going through the process of submitting a formal application to amend the code, but in this case we did. And the request is to allow automobile repair under certain circumstances in the IMU zoning district. The city has two IMU zoning districts. One is the unimproved Hamilton tracks out on Howell Road, large area there. And then also a number of properties that straddle Coon Avenue on the south side of Memorial Boulevard. That area is predominantly, actually probably almost totally developed essentially at this point. The reason why this came about is gentlemen purchased a industrial building on that property with the intent of using it for automobile repair, came into our office wanting a zoning certificate, and I could not provide him one because it's, automobile uses are not amongst those uses that are permitted in the IMU zoning district. If you look at the use chart in the Land Management Code, everything under the column of automobile related or transportation related, none of that is permitted in the IMU. So he crafted an amendment and put it forward where it would allow for automobile repair in fact, let me just read it. Automobile, actually he wrote auto, and we put in parentheses motive, just to make the language consistent with the rest of the ordinance. Auto repair and maintenance in buildings constructed prior to 2010 with outdoor storage and service areas screened with opaque fencing and landscaping in accordance with Article 5. This would become a permitted use. There are no buildings that were constructed, or let me rephrase that. There are no real structures out in the Howell Road tracks. So when that area develops out, this use will not occur out in that development. IMU is designed as a district that's kind of almost like an office park zoning, but with some retail and some light manufacturing associated with it. And automobile, in general, automobile uses were generally intentionally kept out of it. However, in this particular case, since it's going to apply to the one area that's already developed, which already has some automobile repair uses in it, we don't see the harm. So that is the first one. Planning Commission had a public hearing on this, and they did recommend approval. So before I move on to the second one, I thought I would maybe see if anybody has any questions about this one.
I have one question. So you say most of the area is developed and, I was somewhat familiar with the area. What were the previous uses of the building?
I don't remember off the top of my head. It seemed to me it was some sort of warehousing use. The building that that he purchased is the one as you're heading east on Memorial, and you pass Coon. It's the building on the right, just before you hit where the old railroad tracks crossed over.
You're heading east on Wilson.
So near the,
But I say Memorial,
This
right?
is a
My
pool
apologies,
place.
Wilson, yeah.
right, near like a pool place.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And there are actually 2 automobile repair businesses in this district at this time. As far as we can tell, one of them is a valid non-conforming use because it was there before the IMU district was laid on that area. And then the second one appears to be a violation that slid in under the radar within the last year or two. If this amendment is approved, then those 2 uses would go from a non-conforming use and a likely illegal use to potentially permitted uses. So clean up a little bit of enforcement issue there as well. But this also, the way this works, we never did envision automobile-type uses in the IMU district as it develops out on raw land, such as on the Howell Road tracks. That won't be affected by this, so we don't see the harm to it.
If I'm not mistaken, when you directly past the pool place used to be, I want to say it was a propane filling station. It was right there, right on Wilson Boulevard itself.
Sounds about right, yeah, but,
Right beside it, yeah. I think
Yeah.
that- I mean, that's gone, of course, but.
yeah, but this particular, and again, text amendments deal with the city as a whole, not just individual properties, but what
Right.
spurred this one is it's a fairly tall building, looks like close to, it's got a lot of overhead. It looks like a
Yeah.
small warehouse
Yeah,
essentially, right
yeah.
there at the railroad
Yeah.
crossing, so.
So the crossing that no longer, do they still run on that line?
Not that I'm aware of.
I don't think so either.
And on the other side of that is the funeral home and all, which
Sure.
is residential zoning. over
Which
there.
is separated by a dense forest, basically.
Yeah, and I think there's some rock out crops and such in
Yeah.
there as well. So,
And you said the public hearing scheduled to end of the month?
Yes.
This month, okay.
Okay, moving on to the second issue. This is a bit more complex. This is an amendment to the subdivision ordinance to basically fill a pinhole in our ordinance that kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense and allow a project to move forward. Before I move into it, we provided an explanation. The language itself is a bit complex, but I am prepared to give you a walkthrough of a PowerPoint to explain what generated this and what we're trying to achieve. But before I go into that, I want to see if y'all want that, to make sure I'm not spending a bunch of time that you don't want. Should I move forward then? Okay. Where do I point this? Thank you. Okay. What we have is a situation where there's a developer who has acquired 3 properties here in the city. They are adjacent to one another, they're very narrow. They were created by simplified plat. Simplified plat is something that's used to develop land or existing improvements, and it's specifically stated as not for development purposes. Whenever we have a property that comes in for development, where we know that there's a simplified plat in effect on the property, we tell them in addition, whatever site plans that you may need, you also need to replat the property with a final plat. It's just nuances of the way the ordinance is written. In this particular case, we have places around the city where lots were subdivided decades ago prior to our current land ordinance requirements for minimum lot area, lot width, et cetera, and also land uses. Using an example, one measure, this is, example will be down along Corbett and Coon in that area as well, are when these properties were subdivided 100 years ago or so, they were just developed in regular 25-foot wide interval lots. And back then, you weren't just limited to the lot that you bought. Back then, oh, I want a little bit more land, they just sold you an extra 25 feet and you cobbled it together for your properties, for your house. Also, keep in mind that 100 years ago, we did not have zoning, which limited use types, so you could build apartments, you could build townhouses, single families, et cetera. There's just wasn't a whole lot of control. So what we have is we have a lot of lots of record that do not meet current zoning requirements. When we have a lot of record, we do allow people to build a single-family home on them. They may need to do lot averaging, they may need to do variances possibly from the Board of Zoning Appeals, but in order to avoid takings claims, everybody who has a residentially zoned lot in the city, regardless of its size, is going to be able to build a house on it, a single-family home. So this is an example of regularized 25-foot wide lots. Oh, that's right. Okay. The particular example that we have is somewhere around the 1920s. A property owner bought 2 lots and built a block of 3 townhouses across those lots. Now, this property is in the Armad zoning district, which does not allow townhouses. And of course, there was no paying attention to the interior lot line. So you had 3 units across 2 lots with 1 interior property line going through the center unit. Some lots or groups of lots have been improved with a single-family dwelling, 2-family dwellings, and in some uncommon cases, like I said here, townhouses. And then I mentioned earlier that basically you just cobble together as many lots as that you wanted. I am going to point it in the right direction sooner or later. Okay, now what we have here is a graphic representation of what ended up happening. Is you have 3 townhouses, they don't have uniform party walls running through them. And so what you see here outlined in blue is roughly the exterior walls and the interior party walls of those 3 units, and you notice how the middle unit is split between the 2 lots. The 3-unit structure has been a non-conforming use in the Armad zoning district. What's that? Right, sorry. This is a picture of the building before it was destroyed by fire. It's down in the south end off of Wilson Boulevard. It's a 3-unit. Again, the property lines don't go much past the 2 sides of the house or the building. It was a non-conforming use, and then several years ago, property owner came in and subdivided it using the simplified plat process to put each one of these individual houses on separate lots for sale to other parties. However, they never did pull the trigger on the sales. They did all stay under common ownership. And I pointed in the right direction that time. So, properties subdivided by simplified plat cannot be developed in such time as they are re-recorded as a final plat, and amendments in recent years have ended this practice, and such subdivisions are now processed as minor subdivisions. So we've noticed this issue in the past, and we've already corrected that. We don't allow simplified plats to be used for this anymore. The 3 units on the 3 lots were removed by the owner by choice or lost by calamity. And again, I did this PowerPoint as a generic example. In this particular case, the 3 units were severely damaged by fire and the property owner just decided to tear them down. Now, what we have here is 3 lots that are even narrower than they were before, and they could be as little as 12 feet wide on a property subdivided by simplified plat. Simplified plats, again, not for development purposes, meaning the now vacant property cannot be redeveloped without submitting a final plat. Right. The net result is 3 very narrow lots without development rights, because again, you can't do anything until you have a final plat. But when you final plat, you actually have to comply with current ordinance requirements. The Board of Zoning Appeals cannot approve a variance to increase lot yield. Therefore, lots 5 and 6 would have to be recorded as a single-family dwelling lot. That's because these 2 lots together now, per our current rules, only meet the minimum lot requirement in that zoning district for a single-family dwelling. So the only thing that our ordinance currently allows this property to be done is to be re-recorded as 1 single-family lot for a single-family home. Could not do a duplex on it. This amendment would permit the abandonment of the simplified plat, recording a final plat with lot configuration as it appeared before the simplified plat was recorded in the land records. No more lots are permitted than existing on the old plat, which means if you had 2 before, you're not going to get more than 2. But basically what it does is it wipes away the simplified plat and allows you to start over. And this is actually be consistent with the way the property lines typically are going to be in the community around it. and they would have development rights for one single-family home on each lot. The developer will then be free to proceed with developing the property as if the block of townhouses had never been constructed. They could construct 2 single-family detached dwellings, one on each lot, subject to lot averaging or possible variances for setbacks. Just depends on the circumstances and what they're looking to build. What it also allows them to do, and this is what this particular developer wants to do, is it opens a track within the ordinance which currently is not available to allow them to build a semi-detached dwelling on each lot. The way the ordinance is currently written, you can do this. It does require variances from the Board of Zoning Appeals, but it's pretty much a no-brainer kind of situation. But as of right now, again, there's no path to this within the current ordinance. In this particular neighborhood, there are other duplexes that are built similar to this. And what this also does is it allows by going back to the original 2-lot configuration in this particular instance, it gets past the ordinance prohibition of the Board of Zoning Appeals granting variances in order to increase density. A number of years ago, there was a problem in our ordinances where people were applying to the BZA simply because they wanted more units on their property than the ordinance would allow. So the ordinance was amended to prohibit the BZA from granting variances specifically to create to increase density. So right now the ordinance only allows 1 dwelling unit. By adopting this would allow these 2 individual lots to go back into place, and they could have the right to do a dwelling on each lot. Now, they could go to the BZA now because they have a right on each lot to then build them attached to one another. It kind of backdoors it in a little bit of a way while still maintaining the integrity of the ordinance. And that's all I had on that.
So you're saying that they tear the structure down, get rid of the lot lines that are there now, have the ability to then go back and cut the property in half, the whole of the property in half.
As it existed when the
Right.
simplified plat was created.
And
Now,
then build basically a duplex or half a double on each lot,
they could build a single on each lot, or they could apply to the BZA to do a double, yes.
on the 2 lots combined.
Correct. You're still not gonna
With the
get more
lot
than
line
2
there.
units.
Okay, so you're still not gonna get more than 2. It isn't like they can subdivide it, get 2 lots, in other words, get rid of the lines that are there now, get 2 lots, and then put some type of over-under on each of the lots.
That's correct.
Yeah, I mean, that would be bad.
Yeah, and staff
So-
would not recommend that in any way. But what this does is it just goes back and erases the simplified plat. Now, it doesn't work for somebody if prior to the simplified plat, it was just 1 lot. It doesn't allow you to create 2 lots where 2 lots did not exist. In this particular case, when they created the 3 lots to break up the townhouse, it was sitting on 2 lots. It allows them to go back to that. So this is very specific. It affects a very limited number of properties potentially around the city. There are a handful of others out there theoretically that this could affect, but it's a very targeted kind of situation. But as of right now, you have 3 lots there that you cannot build on unless you re-subdivide it to put a final plat in place, and the current rules of the ordinance only based on the size of the property limit it to 1 single-family dwelling. So I appreciate your patience because it's complex trying to explain that.
When you do that, will that mean then that the current setbacks for these lots, as the code applies, kick in?
The current setbacks kick in. However, there are built-in processes within the code that allows us to take into consideration the existing built environment. We have lot averaging.
Okay.
Where we go out and we figure out what the average
That
distance
answers
the
the
houses are
Right.
from side property lines and the front property line.
So it won't look like something sitting back when the rest of the houses are along the street?
No, as a matter of fact, we would actually require build-to along the front.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and if for some reason, if the property is even still further constrained, they still, above and beyond that, still have the ability also to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, asking to go even closer to the street or the side property lines as well, if necessary.
What's your estimate of the number of these that potentially exist? Would you say
Half a dozen, maybe?
half a dozen? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, a lot of it, and they're gonna be individualized situations as well, because some of these may exist in the R-Med zoning district, which does allow townhouses. So what you're actually dealing with there isn't necessarily a situation where it's a non-conforming, expired non-conforming use, because you can do townhouses, but it might be non-conforming to minimum lot area requirements and things like that. So I caution the idea of saying there's half a dozen of these specifically like this around the city. There's a half a dozen situations which will all have their own unique set of circumstances, which may fall under this umbrella. So. But it solves the problem for the applicant at hand, so.
Right. Mayor asked me to take over, I can step away for a minute. Any other questions?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is the excessive use update. Kathy, Chief, Gary.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Yep, we're here, Planning Code Administration Department and the Police Department to give you an update on the excessive use of city services ordinance and the rental licensing ordinance. We're gonna start with the excessive use ordinance. In the packet, we gave you a memo that kind of summarized how those two ordinances work. And then there's also some data from HPD in the packet, and then we also have PowerPoints to get into a little more detail on the code administration side. But just to give you briefly background in case you're not too familiar with the two codes, the Excessive Use of City Services Program was adopted on April 18th, 2014, and the intent was to advance the safety and welfare of neighborhoods throughout Hagerstown by educating landlords on tenant screening and leases, and by holding all property owners accountable when chronic nuisance situations occur at their properties. The goal is not to be punitive to property owners, but to encourage actions that result in lower calls for service and prevents nuisance situations from occurring and perpetuating in our neighborhoods. So what kicks in is that if you have a property where we're starting to get recurring calls, there's certain, depending on what they are, a certain number of calls, police qualifying calls. For code administration, it's 3 qualifying calls of certain types of things within a 12-month period. If you hit that mark, then you get on the list of a chronic nuisance property. And after that point, any new calls within the following 12-month period, you're subject to a fee, so sort of a punitive fee, trying to encourage better behavior. And after 2 police calls, then you are required to do training with the police department to try to help solve the problems that are occurring there. And if you don't cooperate with the police department, then there is the possibility that you could then become, have your residential operator license revoked, which then creates problems for you with the rental licensing program, because you cannot operate a rental property without the residential operator's license. We haven't so far had to revoke any of those because we work with people, and so far people have been pretty good about working with the police department to make sure they solve their problems. But that's how that's set up. So that's basically a rundown of the excessive use ordinance.
Thank you, Kathy. Mayor, Council, City Administrator, let me just kind of give you an update and explain what is a disturbance, what is a qualifying call. Under Chapter 95, excessive use of city services, there's 10 calls. There's 10 qualifying calls, and let me just give those to you. Controlled dangerous substance or paraphernalia, possession or sale, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, liquor law violations, public consumption, open container of alcohol, loitering, loud noise complaint, prostitution, public urination, indecent exposure, undesirable, intoxicated, or suspicious persons, or any conduct which constitute a felony under Maryland law. A disturbance call shall not include any call for service which is a domestic violence case. Want to be very clear with that. We just kind of want to give you a little breakdown. Wrong way. There we go. Qualifying calls. And to give you a breakdown since April 2014 to present, we broke it down in a pie chart so it's palatable for you and you can consume it. The total calls for service since the inception of 2014, the calls that were initially qualified through the PD were 2,606. Total qualifying calls after vetting through our excessive use coordinator and manager was 1,652. The total initially qualifying calls thus far year-to-date in 2017 have been 375. After we vetted them, there's been 282 calls. The total uses, as we go into occupancy in the city of Hagerstown, we have 17,010. Rental licensing, 9,346, owner occupied, 6,344, HHA, 1,320. We break down that further when we go to qualifying calls, and this is for 2016, the rental properties, is we had 668. And you'll see the ledger there. We have a light blue and we have a dark blue. Starting at the top, we had Potomac Towers with 2 calls, Nolan with 12, HHA other were 24, Gateway Crossing were 7, and the rental licensing program 624. Now we just want to break it down even a little bit further as we move forward. When we go to qualifying calls for HHA communities, you'll see through the ledger, and we'll go, Brooks had 0, Gateway Crossing had 7. We had a percentage of our total qualifying calls for the year. Jonathan Street, which was 5, Frederick Manor 4, Nolan Village 12, Potomac Towers 2, and Walnut Towers 15. We broke it up numerically and percentage-wise based on the total volume of calls that we had. And then when we break that down by Part 1 crimes, and Part 1 crimes we mean serious crimes, felonies. In 16, in the areas surveyed were 176 total citywide, were 1,672. And again, we'll break it down. Potomac Towers were 11, Nolan Village 18, Parkside and Douglas Court 5, Frederick Manor 2, Gateway Crossing 33, West End was 52, Locust Point 53, and the remainder throughout the city. Just wanted to kind of give you a breakdown. We gave you, when did we do that last? Was it August we did the last one? Last year, we did the last update on the citywide services. What's important for you to know is that, you know, our relationship and our tenacity when it comes to qualifying calls. Officer Kendall receives the calls, he gleans them, he vets them, and then we make a determination when we're going to send, we're going to send a letter. The fine structure is fairly simple. First offense is $100, second offense is $250, the third offense is $500, and subsequent is $500. We've used it to a degree, but we've also used the education aspect, to train our the people that own these properties and that rent them. It's very important. We do have a couple cases that we have had to use the fine structure. We have an individual in the southern part of the city that has had over 12 calls, and that we've had to levy, calls regarding his rental housing, and that will be attached, accordingly. So we're tenacious with it. We'll continue. We like the program, and it's a good thing for the city. So that's all I have.
And then we also have a PowerPoint on the code administration side of the excessive
Real
use.
quick, I have a quick question for you, Chief.
Sure.
If you don't mind. With the qualifying calls, because those are actually obviously the calls that qualify for the program.
Yes.
Like, for example, when you had the breakdown of some of the properties.
Sure.
So like Gateway Crossing, for example.
Yes.
there's 7 qualifying calls,
Yes.
but there was 2,600 calls for service.
Very good question. 2,600 calls for service are everything from fire department,
Correct.
EMS, welfare checks, checks on people. There are a variety of different things. Gateway Crossing is very hard to map because part of Gateway and the streets, some of it is housing, some of that street is market price housing. So it's, we kind of mapped that whole area.
I guess it's all in general. I mean, again,
Yes.
Nolan has 12, but there's 500 and some calls for service a year there.
Yes.
I mean, on and on, I'm talking about the calls for service seem to be greatly inflated compared to what is actually
qualified as a qualifying
Those
call.
calls are not all police calls, not even by far. We can break them down. As a matter of fact, if you remember what I gave to everybody regarding Gateway and Nolan and those things earlier I think it was this year, when I gave you copies of those packages, which had that number 2,600, on the bottom of it, there's a stipulation that what those calls include.
Right.
You know, and it include a variety of different other calls. We get called, and other people get called to those communities when they call the call center for a variety of different things. Not all of them are crimes. No.
So, yeah, and I don't want, and maybe this is my question, I don't want folks to get misled by what you see here. I mean, you show, and you know, you identified the housing authority in particular in this presentation, you know, and indicated what a small part of the pie that is. As it applies, and I think folks should understand this, as it applies to the calls you receive for those particular places. Not, in other words, folks shouldn't see that and go, oh, Nolan Village, 12 qualifying calls, you know, and as a comparative to the pie overall, you know, it's extremely small and therefore, you know, an extremely, you know, minor segment of the activity that both the police and fire service provide yearly. That's just not the case. I mean, you can see that small number of 12 or whatever the number is, and it's just not the case. And so I don't want, you know, folks to be misled on that particular matter. Use this example as walking through there Sunday, and there's a guy going up and down the street on a mini bike that's clearly not permitted on public streets, and, you know, 60 miles an hour, and it's as loud as can be, and nobody's calling. Nobody's calling, nobody's coming, nobody's showing up. You know, nobody's identifying that individual. Nobody's qualifying that as some, you know, nuisance to the neighborhood, but it's happening. And there were clearly indications that individuals going back and forth among two groups of you know, some form of public intoxication. Nobody's calling. Nobody's reporting that, but it clearly has an impact on the neighborhood just adjacent to it, behind, and I think it was like Court 2. And so I don't want folks to get, you know, a picture that you know, 12 calls as a part of this pie of you know, 300 and some or whatever it was is you know, is a depiction of that level of activity, because it's just not, it's not a clear picture. And so I think Paul's point that you look at the total calls, so let's say the police has, you know, 10,000 calls a year. I think that applies more closely to the total call volume and not qualifying calls in this particular case. And in addition to that, what isn't here are two things. One is, in any case, whether it's the housing authority, whether it's, you know, a private landlord, whether it, you know, it's a boarding house of you know, some addictions oriented service, you don't trace that back to the place, right? So if an individual goes down here and they rob sheets, but it didn't happen, you know, and that person happens to live in the 700 block of North Potomac Street. You don't tie that act that occurred at Sheets on Dual Highway back to that 700 block of North Potomac Street.
We would never do that.
I know, that's what I'm saying. So I don't want people also to get the misconception that, you know, that because you're not getting a call at a particular place, that individuals of that nature aren't living at those particular, you know, places of residence that are committing acts elsewhere within the community. So I don't want folks to get that misunderstanding from these numbers either. So that's one component that's missing, from this type of analysis. And the second point is, out of that big piece of the pie, it's a fairly diverse grouping of housing. In other words, what there's I don't know what the number is, 40% of the rentals that have a Section 8 voucher. And so for me, in that big blue pie, I think, and I realize that can be taken, anywhere, but I think it's important to understand, and I say that because of this. Folks, they'll approach me all the time and say, you got to get rid of that Section 8 housing in your city. And I say, hey, and I've said this before, you drive down the street, some person who lives, way out of town comes through and says, looks at that and says, oh, that's a rundown place. I bet that's Section 8 housing. The individuals, sitting on, and drive past another place and it's fairly well kept and say, there's market. You can't tell. And often case, and more often in this city than not, it's the individuals in that complete private market that don't participate in Section 8 that have some of the worst kept properties. And the opposite is true, that in many cases, it's the compliance with Section 8 standards that are the properties that are in good order, with stable tenantry that you don't see. And so I don't, on both sides of that equation, I don't want folks to get the misunderstanding from that type of information that one is worse than the other in either of those scenarios. And I've said before, if all residential properties had to live to the standard of compliance to which the Housing Authority and Section 8 is applied, I think you'd see a higher level of standard of living in this community at large. And that's just my opinion on that, because I think that oftentimes we run into cases where, again, it's some of the worst are ones that just let, have no compliance with the orders.
Understand?
Chief, I'm a little confused.
Sure.
If we can, the chart I'm looking at.
Yes.
Now, this chart is showing 2016 calls for service and Part 1 incidents. Now, it's showing on the top all calls for service, and it's showing Nolan Village at 95. Is that an indication of all calls? What do these top figures represent? Of 2016. 2016. Here, you can take this one. Okay.
No, I see it now, 95. There's 95, there's CDS, there's actually more than that. It's nuisance calls, it's 95 calls. Kathy, this is a document that we didn't
Okay,
put together.
that's okay then. If you could, you don't have to do it now, Chief, especially if you didn't put it together.
Yeah.
But if you all could look at it, because one of the things it says here, which is sort of opposite of what Kristen was saying, and I don't know if it's accurate, of the 28,568 calls for service in the city, 1,055 or only 3.7% were calls to public housing locations. But in the same respect, as you can see, when we look at this chart, I'm not sure. So if you all could look at that and get back to us.
The calls I was referenced was Part 1.
I fully understand that.
Okay.
No, I fully understand what you were referencing. And that's,
Yes.
well, and I heard other figures of 500 thrown out. And then I started looking at this one, and I couldn't figure what those numbers represented. And like I said, I don't expect an answer from you right now. You all need to digest that.
Sure.
And maybe you can get back to us on that.
Let me just add, I'll use Nolan Village as an example. In 2016, the city had almost 54,000 calls for service. The calls for service that we had at Nolan Village, which were all crimes, were 540. That, in those calls, and again, as the documents I provided you previously, that includes calls for service where police assisted, whether it be fire, EMS, proactive policing, patrol checks, repossessions of vehicles, traffic hazards, traffic incidents, non-functioning traffic signals, disabled vehicles, they have a variety of different things. Calls for service, what I was referencing was part one crime.
And I totally understand that.
Is that what the 28,000 calls in here, is that referencing part one calls, or?
No,
I
that's
don't
not.
think so, no, I don't think
That's
that's,
part of the discrepancy.
I think, yeah, I think we don't know
Fair
what
enough.
these figures are, so that's.
Yes.
And I thank you. Any other questions?
Kathy, you want to do yours?
Kathy, you're, I'll go. You need me to, copy it?
I got a bad angle.
Person's walking.
Yeah, your way.
I'm not sure.
Sorry.
There we go. Oh, no,
Always
that's the
said
wrong
it
one.
make a better door than a window.
Here comes the head honcho. Yes.
There, yep, that's the one, thank you. All right, so with the excessive use of city services, you've got the HPD qualifying calls, and then you also have code administration. And it's limited to just sanitation, weeds, and the nuisance abatement ordinance. So basically, rubbish, debris, junked items, high grass, and other types of weedy situations that are subject to, that would be considered qualifying calls for code administration. And you have to have 3 within a 12-month period. And for our department, it's mainly vacant properties where this is happening. 71% of our properties are, where we are dealing with situations is vacant properties. 45%, you see on the chart, is totally vacant. The unclassified property, another 26%, that's basically vacant but licensed in the residential program. So it's basically properties that are not being, they're not occupied, the owner's not really taking care of them or paying attention to them, and that's where we're responding to high grass, mainly high grass, but also could be debris, junked items, somebody's moved out and left everything behind. And so that's how it breaks down for us. So only about 23% is rental property. It's mainly for us, it's vacant, and some unimproved lots, a small percentage. This shows the notice of violation for the qualifying property maintenance standard violations for 2013 to 2017. You can see the 3 different codes that it applies to and how it breaks out. And so far in 2017, we're at 2,255. We're kind of at the winding down for the peak for us for the weed situation, which is where we do most of our businesses. People not cutting their grass, and it gets to be close to waist high, and we have to deal with it. Property is identified by inspectors as a violation of the excessive use code. So you got the top line for the past 4 years, total qualifying property maintenance standards notices. The next line, the inspectors have identified properties as excessive use. And then the bottom shows the percentage of the qualifying property maintenance standard violations that are classified as excessive use.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, maybe it's not a question, maybe it's a statement. I have found in my experience that while we sit here and we're looking at the numbers over a 4-year period, and you see the 489, the 355, the 543, and the 410, those are basically the 15 to 20% of property owners that don't come into compliance in the time frame in which the city provides for the codes, for the code violations identified. I think what would be important for this body to understand, and the public at large, and I would bet, I would hedge bets on this, that if I went back and looked at those 350 to 500 or 400 to 500 properties, that probably 300 of them are the same ones every year. In other words, I'm going to bet that in 2014, out of that 489, that a good number of those enforcements would be the same as the 400 for 2017, because you're constantly going back, you know, and addressing the grass and weeds issue from a property that's been dead vacant for 4 years that the lending institution just doesn't want to maintain, or something to that effect.
Somebody's walked away or whatever.
Mhm. That, I think, is an important component, so that folks understand that this isn't, you know, 400 new properties every year that we're trying to bring into compliance. It's repeat offenders that repeat that abuse of excessive services year in and year out.
But I guess what would be good to be known of what are those ones that are lien lien holder, occupier owned, whatever, by the banks, whatnot, that we can't find those people, or are we having these same repeat offenders that we know who they are, but why aren't we doing something about it? Like, what percentage of those, because I agree with you, there
Well, I
probably
bet-
is a lot of repeat offenders, but of that pot.
I
how
bet
many
they
are
match that chart. I bet they match closely on that chart, the pie chart you had before, where it showed 45% vacant, 23% in the rental system, and 20-some percent in the unidentified. You know what I mean? I bet it would match that pretty closely as it applies to your percentage of repeat offenders that staff have to go back,
So you have
and apply the code to
about
every year.
almost a 50-50 split there,
Mhm.
which then goes back to the 50 that we know. Because granted, the whole point of this is to identify places to reduce the calls for services and make, strengthen neighborhoods. Yet, unless it was one of the different programs you mentioned, we haven't actually really revoked anyone's rental license, or we haven't really laid down the hammer, so to speak, on someone. Correct me if I'm wrong.
People are getting assessed the fee, but at least from our standpoint, since most of them are vacant structures, they're getting liened.
Right, the 45% of the vacant structures, but there's the other 55% that make up those other three
The
categories.
unclassified properties chunk is also vacant,
They're all-
but it's licensed in the residential program, so it's not considered licensed in the vacant program. Because you can choose which one you want to license with, but in reality, that 26% is while they're licensed rental properties, they're also vacant.
So you're looking at 71% of
Yeah.
everything is vacant.
And what I'm saying is I bet 60% of those, you're mowing the same yards every
Every
year for the
year.
last couple of years. You're sending the same notices every year for,
Just to answer that one, essentially, when we say we're doing 400, 500 letters for excessive use to properties, a lot of times, the inspector may have gone out there and issued a weed notice to that property back in May, because they didn't take care of it. And then in June, they went back by and they had to issue another weed notice. They'll classify it as, I had to go back in that other month, and so I'm going to identify it as excessive use, because we had to go back in 2 months, we had to keep on telling them to mow their property. So we'll issue an excessive use notice to those people, and those come from me, where I'll mail them out to the property owners. A lot of times, they'll call me and say, I got someone mowing my lawn, or I'll take care of it, and I'm gonna maintain it. So we don't have too many repeat offenders. We only have.
not in the same season. What I'm saying is, if Mr. Smith at 520 North Potomac got a letter in 2015 and said, hey, I got somebody to take care of it, probably did it for the season, part of the season, at least kept it up enough to keep you back off. And in 2016, you're back out, and you're citing Mr. Smith because Mr. Jones called in again. In 2017, you're citing Mr. Smith again because Mr. Jones called in. So, I mean, we're basically the initial seasonal mowers for some of these properties on a recurring basis, especially for the vacant lender owned properties that they're just simply, hedging the market on.
I am happy to say, and we've all heard the continuing saga of my next door neighbor, that somehow or another, we got the attention of the lender. They have property maintenance come in about once every 3 weeks in mow. And so that's positive after 2 years of the city.
And I guess that's the
making it.
goal, is to roll them off
Yeah.
of our,
All right.
quarterly offense list, so to speak, permanently.
Mhm.
And I think that's where you get to the point of what's the hammer to actually do that, so that, that address file for that particular property doesn't just keep growing year after year because you keep doing the same thing, you know what I mean, over and over, citing it. Because the grass is
It
always
does
gonna
get
come back.
people's attention, it's just when we have ones that are basically abandoned, that's
Right, how
where
much
it's a
will
problem.
that zombie legislation that went through the state last year help with some of these vacant properties? Do you have any idea how that may or may not?
The bank has to choose to participate.
That's right.
Right.
See, the state continues to refrain from allowing local governments to execute the level of enforcement that I think you're getting at, because they don't want to upset the banking, lending, and and real estate and
But I thought something
And
went
that's just
through
the
this
bottom
spring that
line.
was similar to what Baltimore City was doing. Is it a watered down version, or, I mean, that's what I'm asking, I mean, what, is there any teeth to that that's
It
gonna
it
help? or-
allows for the bank to do a faster process if the property's been vacant a certain period of time. It doesn't allow for the government to step in and say, hey, we'd like a faster
Still allows them to
process.
hedge what they feel like doing as it applies to the marketability. So you got 1,000 properties that went through the 2008 tank. You sit there and hedge on the ones that you know you can move first, while the ones in community B, you say, you know, we'll take the hits of the letters and, you know, and do the minimal until we think that the market hedges enough to turn our attention to them. And it doesn't matter whether it's this community or any other community, street by street, that's what's happening. And there is no state enforcement capability. I suggested a couple years back that if you're vacant more than X number of years, you get your water and sewer tap rescinded. You wanna pay $10,000 to hook back up to the system.
Kristen, you do make a very good point. No matter what the number is, large or small, it shows the value of this enforcement effort.
The mayor's back, so now we can have some order in this place.
This next slide shows the number of properties from a property maintenance violation perspective that became chronic nuisance since 2014. So there was 62 properties. And that shows you the breakdown of 22% rental, 68% vacant, 10% unapproved lots, and only 0% owner occupied. So it's a big chunk of it, as you can see again, vacant structures that are becoming the chronic nuisance properties.
Yeah.
And then because in many cases they're kind of in limbo with the foreclosure or abandoned, we're not collecting these fees, we're assessing, they're being liened. So they're sitting on the tax bill waiting.
And then that also compounds the problem of trying to sell them at a tax sale. If you have a big enough lien on them, then nobody wants to buy them at a tax sale.
So we have another slide.
And these
that
entities let
shows
you,
the,
because you're basically giving them an interest-free ride
That's right.
till the last second when they come back within that year, because they have that year to come back in and pay it back, and then you don't get it. So you basically, you know, gave them a free ride on their taxes for a year, that's right.
So this slide, which might be the last slide, it is, shows that over the 4 years or 3.5 of the program, we have assessed fees of $12,100 on these chronic nuisance properties, but so far, $8,150 has been liened. And that number will be higher because there's some that have been assessed this year that haven't liened yet. Because that time hasn't come where we say, okay,
We've
time
actually
to
collected
put.
under $4,000.
Now, those are chronic nuisance all based on, like, the,
Not even that
maintenance,
much.
things like that we're talking about, not the qualifying calls, the criminal
This
activity.
is for the
but-
code
but the
administration.
How often, as you apply this enforcement mechanism, do you get responses that we don't want it? Whether it's a family member or, you know, a trust or an estate or a bank that just simply says, you know what, keep sending the letters, we're not doing anything because we don't want it.
The only time we really get the we don't want calls is when it is still registered to the owner that lost the property through the foreclosure process, but never, the bank never filed the transfer of the deed to the
Right,
bank.
which is the thing at the state that has to happen.
Yeah,
We'll never force this issue off center until the state provides for that mechanism.
right.
So people get frustrated when they hear from us when they are the ones being foreclosed.
Yeah, or already lost the property.
That's right.
and-
30 days after eviction or foreclosure, the deed should be required by the state to transfer. That should be the
Nice.
law,
I would agree.
and it's not.
No.
That would answer that question.
Because that's what leads to the biggest frustrations that
It
I get
is.
the calls from when I send these letters, that I don't own the property anymore. Well, according to the state of Maryland, you still do. So you're gonna still get these letters, but I lost it to the bank, and I said, I see those things, but unfortunately, you're
So
still
who
the
ends up
owner.
paying it? Nobody?
Goes on as a lien.
Which is why I said, the only way to force that entity that is lobbying so heavily not to have that enforcement applied, that I can see as a local mechanism to accomplish that, is to say, we're gonna rescind your access to utility. You've been off the system for X period of time, no longer want that service. We can't hold it indefinitely, and when you're ready, you can reapply for connection to the system. Pay the appropriate connection fees.
But it does have, the program does have an impact on those properties that are still managed by someone. It's the ones that are just sort of not taken care of, where it's not having an impact because of this foreclosure challenge. But for like new landlords who don't live in our community, you know, like they get our phone calls, you know, they're like, it does have an impact. The conversations we have with them are kind of comical. When we say, you know, you got high weeds, well, I live in Montgomery County. You're like, doesn't the grass grow in Montgomery County? Because it sure does out here in Washington County. And so you have those kind of comical calls with people. It gets their attention.
And what do we figure up, 80%, 80+% of these properties in total, rental are owned by individuals that live outside of the community? I think that was the number, right?
Now, what do you define as outside the community? Outside of Washington County,
Outside of the city.
outside of the city?
Outside the city, there's a fair amount that live in Washington County. I don't
That's
know what
right,
that
but
number is
outside of the city.
offhand, though, I don't know what that number is offhand, but we can provide it to you
Yeah.
later.
Once you're outside the city, you're outside the city, you know what I mean?
No, I hear you.
You're not.
We have a number of
Same with your
landlords that are
definitions.
well outside, you know,
Right.
in Northern Virginia, in fact. Well, that's all the information, the data we had from HPD and PCAD on the excessive use of city services. There's another presentation on the rental licensing program. I don't know if you want that, because it wasn't clear to us what the intent of this update was. It was basically to hear about excessive use of city services ordinance and how it applies also to rental licensing, or did you want another presentation on the rental licensing program? We do have that, whether you want that today or
Certainly,
next
so
week.
we're looking for recommendations.
Yeah, before we get to that, real quick, just touching on these two things, I guess, and I'm not challenging you guys by any means, but what can we do? I mean, Chris had a suggestion as far as, you know, with utility services and stuff like that. But what can we do to, I guess, further these efforts? Because again, obviously the goal of these were to, I mean, do you really see things changing one way or another? Or it almost seems like it's been mostly a kind of,
We've heard from some landlords who feel like it gives them hope for if they're in a neighborhood that has chronic properties around them, that there's at least a mechanism to try to get something accomplished, if there is someone we can reach.
right.
And maybe that's the question on both of these items, is to differentiate between those two categories of what we feel like we're adequately managing, whether it's excessive calls for service or the crime fraud, and what are the issues we need to be resolving. In other words, you know, we obviously are gonna manage this, whether it's this or rent registration or excessive, whichever one of these components it is, we're gonna continue to manage it in some framework, but there have to be items out there that you've identified that say, okay, we can manage these four things, you know what I mean, that come down the pipe on a daily basis as it applies to compliance. But these are the couple of things that you know, we need to find permanent resolution to. And that, I think, is what I would like to hear, is you know, being able to separate we can manage it, we can manage these things, or we need to resolve.
Well, I agree. I mean, because it's not just managing it, it's having a goal of what is the end goal? What are we trying to get to? Like, is there, you know, a target number, whatever it may be, to get to? Because we can continue to manage it, but is that really gonna make a difference one way or another?
Well, let's take a property that's out of compliance. And, you know, we can manage that process, you know, the enforcement, but, you know, there should be an expectation. You know, we wanna be able to be able to exercise and address, that issue within X number of days. You know what I mean? That we want it to be cleared, after call has been made. And that, you know, that to me, I think is one of the interesting things that I always get from residents. They'll say, well, you know, I emailed you, you know, on X date, you know, how long does it take? And you know, I know it takes time, but, you know, if we're able to give folks that assurance to say, look, this is the time frame in which it will be accomplished. Because then we're managing it and we're, you know, creating a goal of resolving it. I think that same thing sort of applies to the crime-free ordinance, especially as it applies to rentals with larger numbers of units. You know what I mean? Because while one person may be calling in in a 10-unit building, there's probably 8 other people that feel the same way, living in those conditions, that have a great degree of hesitation to want to, make that call or create that I don't know, discord, among fellow residents.
Kathy, is there a list available, or a list of chronic nuisance properties? Do you all have them identified?
We don't make it public, but yes, that's the way we keep track of who needs to get fees.
So, and one of the questions we got from the property owners and landlords association, from time to time, I know Paul and Emily have both brought it up, and I thought about this the other day. Let's take an individual that gets removed from public housing for a violation of one of their rules, a criteria. That person probably isn't leaving the community. They're going to find residents somewhere else, likely within the community. And, we get that question often, is there a mechanism by which those landlords can be aware that has occurred, that individual's not permitted back in public housing or is no longer eligible for Section 8? Because I hear it from caseworkers time and again that work with various individuals. They'll say, well, had John Smith that was involved in this issue, they're not eligible for the various housing resources, and so I got to find them somewhere. And so I put them up in Landlord X's, even though I know Landlord X's place is not a place of livable condition, and John Smith isn't an individual that I'd want to live beside. And I think to myself when I hear that, they're not telling anybody that. You know what I mean? Caseworkers aren't going to tell that, aren't going to convey that information. It just isn't going to happen. And so neither party knows that before the end result is these guys end up being called, for an incident that occurs. And so.
Yeah, I think Don and Krista both bring up great points, and I'd be on board with the same thing. And I guess my question is, you said you have the information, but it's not public. Is there a reason that it's not
And
public?
for us, it's the property owners we keep track of, not the occupants of the
Right.
building.
But I think what he's alluding to is if there's a process that we can identify to help, and I actually wrote it down, you see, to a whole, different set of circumstances, but you'll see in the paper every now and then, deadbeat dads, top 10 deadbeat dads in the area. They have them in the paper, and I'm right there who they are, and that information's accessible. There should be a list, as Don said, of property owners that are repeat offenders that are known. And there should be as well, a list of repeat, have some, tenants, so you can have some tenant accountability. So to protect the good property owners of that nature. So, again, Kristen said I've alluded to it in the past, and Don brought it up as well. I think it's a great idea, have that information more accessible and more readily available to the public. I don't know, it sounds like you guys agree with that as well, but,
Just to update on that, that would require an ordinance change. The ordinance specifically states only HPD's list is public, codes is not.
Well, if there is a chronic nuisance property, what's the last bit of action you can take against that property? Can you take the ownership to court?
We can, for majority of the chronic nuisance ones, a lot of them are abatements where we are mowing their property.
Yeah.
And with those, a fine is typically assessed as well, or a citation. and then we do take them to court. We take the owners. If it's a foreclosed property, we do not take that to court, because the owner is listed with the state of Maryland of the person that lost the property, so we do not take those to court. But if there is an owner that is not in a foreclosure, we will take them to court, but no one ever shows up to court cases.
I thought in our last ordinance passage, we redefined what an owner constitutes.
We do have an owner as part of the lender as well that we could find as well. And we just never pursued that based on legal advice that we've received.
As it applies to being able to define them as such.
Correct.
Track
I
down the
understand.
lender. Because the state tax assessment, which is
Right.
where we get our information, is still showing the
Right.
person who got the mortgage.
And that, I think, gets to that question of, sort of, what's the goal? Right there is one goal. How do we come up with a solution that forces that? Because clearly, a big piece of the pie are the vacant and abandoned properties. You know what I mean? So we need some more readily available tool to be able to provide you guys, to be able to address that in a more permanent fashion. Like I said, otherwise, we're the annual mowers for 972 X Street,
But as you mentioned a few moments ago, quite accurately, I believe, the General Assembly just simply won't give it to us.
And that's what I said, we need to see if we can identify something
If we do something
locally
locally, yeah. See what we can
to
do.
be either a carrot or stick to make that happen.
So when we have an abandoned property that we have to unfortunately go in and take care of, weeds, grass, or whatever, we bill that, whatever the current property owner is.
Right.
And do we fine them at the same time? And what's that fine?
I always say it's $320 before we touch a blade of grass. It's $200 fine, $100 administrative fee, and a $20 technology fee, and then whatever the cost is for us to mow the property.
And we've set those limits ourselves, correct?
In the code.
And they can be raised.
I guess with a code amendment, they could, and we're limited to $1,000.
I mean, if
by
you
state
made
law.
if you made it fiscally unsound for a person to not take care of their property, even though it's abandoned, someone should be able to take care of that property. If you made it so expensive when you find them, do you think that would make a difference?
For the abandoned ones, we're just leaning all of that
We're leaving it
expense.
anyway.
Okay, but we're leaning it to what amount?
To the
then?
to the tax bill, and then it's piling and piling, and then they go to tax sale, no one bids on them, and it rolls year after year. For those ones that are
And the
really
lender just rides it.
heavy.
And the lender's just riding until the market is of a position. And the more you lean, the larger that becomes and the less marketable that
How
eventually.
does the lender escape from not paying it? Maybe that's the part I'm just not.
Because they don't take deed ownership of the property.
Yeah, they don't own it. Gotcha.
And that's the.
We have a
component-
perfect example
That's
up
the
here on
caveat.
Potomac Street.
That's what the state won't change.
Right.
And that's why I said we need to find some
Right,
mechanism
whether it's
around
like the
that.
water tap down, something you're talking about there or something. Yeah, Doc, I agree with everything you said there, and I agree with what Don said as well, what you said earlier about of having this information available to the
And-
public. So that people know on both sides.
Do we
what the
contact
owners
the lender and let them know?
If we know who it is.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there should be some record of who the lender is, unless it's a private lender. I mean, you know.
It all depends on the cases. It's difficult to say, because sometimes the
Someone's on the
lender
title.
that had it may have sold that to someone else, and then we don't have records, and usually takes the legal to research who is the actual holder of the note on the property.
Which is like $300 to find clear title holder. But I guess in that case, let's say a property's been on that list that you have up there, and they've been on it for the last 3 years. For me, I would be instituting a program whereby, once it hits that 3-year mark, I'm automatically sending a notification to, I'm searching it, sending a notification saying, hey, this property has been identified as vacant, for X period. We have cited it on X occasion. Could you please confirm whether or not you have any continuing interest in the property, And if not, please contact the city so that we may discuss options for disposal. That, to me, is sort of like a goal that identifies a mechanism in which to maybe move some of these off, because we haven't asked the question. The lender's sitting there sort of hedging, when a thing's gonna turn, when a thing's gonna wanna turn, and maybe in some of these cases, and it may be a small number, but that small number may be some of the worst, scenarios, and they may say.
I mean, it may be the lender says, well,
just gonna-
what if I just sell it to you for $1? And then the
Right.
city buys it for $1 and takes it over, puts it in an ownership program and turns it around to somebody who can use it and maintain the property. I mean, there's gotta, and Kristen's right, there has to be an
identify
end
for
result.
demolition.
There has to be an end game that we can reach, period. And have a resolution for that piece of property. There has to be an end. We just can't continue to do the same things that we're doing, and we're not gaining anything that way. I mean, even if the gain is demolition, the point is that we've gotta get to that end game.
That's why we've been exploring this issue of a strategy for the ones that go to the county tax sale and there are no bids. There would be, the county could take those properties, or we could step in and take those properties, but the challenge is figuring out then what, because we don't want to end up ourselves holding on to these chronic nuisance properties. So that's, we've been having a lot
Okay,
of meetings.
but
to
right
staff
now,
up.
we're maintaining these chronic nuisance properties, and we're not getting anything in return for it.
Right.
I mean, so what's the difference?
Then the bills go to the city. if
Then
we
at the end of the
don't-
day, if we had to, let's just say out of the 62 that you've identified, let's say that there's 50 that fall in that repetitive category. And out of that 50, let's say 20 of them say, you know what, you're right, give me a buck, it's yours. Then we gotta have a mechanism that says, okay, you assess it and say, this property is of a condition that is not markedly repairable, and we demolish it. And I know there's cost associated with that, I know that. And it's demolished, and you then either place the property back within the private market, or you turn it over to the adjacent property owners, because God knows that there's clearly a shortage, especially in this core, for these properties. And Steve just had one up there with any type of yard space, and you say, you know what, you two split this yard, and we're done with that issue. That, to me, is a much better result at the end of the day than driving up Locust Street and seeing those 4 row houses, continually just get worse and worse. Because the reality is, as Lou just pointed out, as they get worse, nobody around them is benefiting. The tax stability around them is not benefiting. It would cost me 20 grand to tear them down and dissolve the property among the respective owners. I'm gonna make that back on the fact that my tax base isn't going to continue to decline and slide backward because, of those assessments decline, because they're creating that
We're not getting a tax base from those properties.
degrading conditions within the neighborhood. Like that, to me, again, is another solution.
But it's
Yeah,
an
I
end
agree
game.
with that, and then also those other parts that are outside that initial pod that you identified, going into the discussions we had the other week of like current properties we already own, coming up with other mechanisms source to get those properties back from tax.
That's right.
So, yeah, I'm all in on both those.
Kathy, does the state have a program to provide grants to tear down the properties that Kristen's talking about? Is there a specific program?
But, yeah.
It gets
Comes to state
challenging
provide
if you
funding.
use state funds and you want to tear down, and these would most likely be considered historic buildings, then you have to get the Maryland Historic Trust involved. So it's difficult to do.
Okay, forget that
to
idea.
do demolition with state money.
Get it.
Yeah,
There's not even,
Even with the
Yeah.
state
Yeah.
smart growth demolition grant?
still have to go through the Maryland Historical Trust process.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I still
You
think
still have to
figure out
go.
something else. That ain't
Yeah.
gonna work.
Well, we have money budgeted in PCAT's budget this year to enable some abatements.
Yeah, we try to put some funding
Like
in there.
150 grand, right?
And we're working with the attorneys
Which-
for 2
which-
right now.
Which I've said, and I know this is unpopular, but I'm telling you right now, as a citizen taxpayer of this city, if you told me tomorrow you're gonna raise my tax rate a penny, that's about $20 to me for a year to generate, and that penny generates $250,000. If you told me as a taxpayer that 250 grand is going to go directly to the code department for demolition, demolition only, I would be more than happy as a taxpayer to pay that extra $20 every year to start seeing some of these properties dissolved or come down. And then that's my 2 cents on that issue as it applies to, finding.
Well, I think the same thing can be accomplished but without raising the penny.
Back to the part real quick, touch on some of the vacant, you brought up a good point with some of the verbiage about, have a call conversation. Things that came in the past when we talk about the vacant structures. How about especially some of these older homes that have been on the market, that are for sale, that have been on now the market for sale for over a year, going into year 2, and things of that nature? I guess is there any type, I guess the way that the code is currently written, correct me if I'm wrong, they still fall in the vacant structure program because even though they're actively marketed for sale, but they've been vacant for over a year, they have to enter that program and pay the appropriate fees and whatnot. Is that correct?
Yeah, we gave some more latitude for
If
if
they're
you
not
were.
MLS listed.
Yeah, if you were actively marketing them for sale. We provided a longer period of time. And the real estate market seems to be getting better in Hagerstown, that houses are selling more quickly.
I guess my concern is again, when you go back, you have someone that's actively marketed it, and it's been on active market for, the whole continuum of time. I don't feel that they should have to go into that program. I don't know if those are the properties that we're really identifying as nuisance properties per se, or at least there should be some discretion for you guys to make a decision of whether, yes, this needs to be identified and, managed and looked after, or, is this a property that does not? So.
Typically,
Is this a
the
for
vacant
sale property
properties,
that's being maintained and,
Right.
right.
I mean, this all comes up to where we're talking
But
about
they
the
are,
house
if-
on the terrace that they came up.
If they're MLS listed, they're exempt, right?
Not exempt.
After a
Yeah.
year.
Time.
for
Yeah,
first
they
year
have-
that they're
yeah.
First
listed.
year, and then after the year, they're not.
Well, I can tell you, I've looked at some in there. I mean, they're not getting sold anytime soon. That's-
Right, exactly, and that's, I don't know, I don't think, to me, that's not the intent of the ordinance now. Again, that was enacted before my time, but just a thought.
No, I told you my thought on that. Tax structure has to change for some of those properties to move. That's just
Oh,
bottom
yeah,
line.
well, that's a whole different conversation.
I know.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but.
Yeah.
we're
So
looking
what
at
are
now.
we,
Does that property?
what have we accomplished
Nuisance.
through this tonight? Because I wasn't here for some of
Well,
this.
those are the 2 pieces I'd like to see come back out of this discussion on both of those items. Here's the things that we're managing, and here's how we plan to continue to manage them. And here's some offerings and options for solutions to some of the things we feel need to actually be
And
resolved.
what are our
and sort of
goals?
put
What
to
are our
bed.
numbers? What are our target numbers? What are we trying to get? We need to have a plan, a goal, a plan. Like you said, you just can't continue just to manage the same
We
thing.
we can't. And I know what Kathy's saying about not taking of these properties, but, we're probably sending out a crew 3 times a summer, to take care of the yard anyway, and get rid of the weeds, and we're charging them $620 or
Well, we take the
$320 every
properties
single
that
time.
Chris said, go back
They're
and
not
do
getting
the
paid
property
anyway,
value.
and so we're
Give them
already expending all the funds and not getting anything back.
Yeah, we were hoping that the new land bank legislation that the state passed would enable us to partner with someone who could become eligible as a land bank, so that the county gives it to the city, and then the city makes some arrangement with this land bank, and we get rid of the liens, and then they find a new property owner.
Yeah.
I mean, one of those very types of initiatives that I brought up 2 years ago, after we had the houses, you got $8,000 if the house is vacant more than 12 months in the city, through that city program. And I said at that time, this city has an astronomical number of duplexes. And a lot of times, we hear the stories of, somebody lives in one half, or landlord owns one half, and it's in good condition, and then the other half that's attached is not in great condition. And what I've said then was, and this again is another one of those goals, we identify a program whereby we work with those private landlords and offer some city incentive in those instances. And here's that area of, identifying vacant structures, whereby if we could incentivize the owner, a good landlord that has one half, to be able to acquire that other half, that we create some type of incentive process between the landlord and in the case of a lending institution that has it, or a family that's, gotten it and no longer wants it, to be able to acquire that, you know what I mean, and own it in total. And
Now, that example you're talking about, the property owner, it's on the one side, he also owns the other side also, you're saying it's still, it's split?
A lot of times it's split, and you'll find that the one side's
That's also
being well
clarified,
kept,
right.
and then the other side is not.
Yeah, the solution for some of these ones that are, because there's some vacant lots that are on the tax sale no bid list, the solution might be just to clear off the liens, give it to the neighbor, or split it down the middle and give it to the two
Right.
side by
Yeah,
side.
let's
But there
talk, I
are-
mean, we'd have to talk to the county because they,
We are.
And we have been.
well, let's make that a goal of trying to accomplish that, at least on the vacant lots. And we can work toward,
Well, I think Kristen's ideas need to be looked at
right,
as well. with some
right, toward
recommendations
Christian's
to come back in.
resolutions and some other things.
There's a meeting in 2 weeks.
Okay, cool, great.
And then what, you guys, were you doing the rental licensing, or?
We can,
have it prepared if you would
we
like.
We're not
can,
gonna talk about that tonight.
we can move that to next week's
Yeah.
agenda.
Great.
I mean, you guys can do
Yeah.
that next week? Okay.
We assume that you might need more than one
Okay.
meeting to get with rental licensing, because excessive use was gonna be a topic
Right.
of
Okay,
interest.
we'll move that to next week.
So play right into your hands, did we?
Although we were ready.
Thank you.
Ready?
Aaron, could you do me a favor and call the young gentleman in? We are going to recognize this evening the Pony League 14U Eastern Division champions who will be going to Washington, PA for the Pony League World Series on Friday. Put the young man here, and put the old guy on the command. Coaches, can you come up front?
Yeah, I got all three of them here.
Okay.
Tony's coming, where's Bull? You know, good.
Thank you. I wasn't ready. Parents, then.
Sorry for making so much noise, it's just tough to keep it quiet.
The only voice I heard was yours.
You're probably right. You know, in a previous life, I used to.
Oh, I know.
I used to be a PA assistant.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, again, we're here this evening, we're gonna recognize the Hagerstown Pony League 14U All-Star team that just got done winning the Eastern Regional,
Eastern Zone.
Eastern Zone in North Carolina, right? All right, and now you guys are going to Williamsport, or Washington, PA, to play in the World Series.
Yes,
And that game was, first game's Friday?
our first game back.
First game is Friday. So, we want to congratulate you. I have some special recognition awards for each of your players and the coaches. And we want to wish you well come this week, at the end of the week. Anyway, it reads like this, and I'm just going to read one. It reads, special recognition to the Hagerstown Pony League 14U All-Stars, Ryan Angles. Who's Ryan Angles? Who's he at? Okay, there he is.
Right here.
All right. The city of Hagerstown would like to recognize the Hagerstown Pony League 14U All-Stars and their coaching staff on advancing to the 2017 Pony League World Series. Your collective hard work and perseverance earned you victory on the baseball field and has taught you lessons you can apply in other arenas of life. You have made a great name for yourself in the city of Hagerstown, and we wish you continued success as you move on to the World Series. Way to represent Hagerstown, Washington County, and the state of Maryland. Signed by me.
Thanks,
Can I get Josh Black?
Josh.
Cole Breckville? I think they put him in order of how they went. David Cleaver?
Get them on.
What?
Clever? Clever, Cleaver. Tyler Crane.
Yeah.
Heard you had an awesome night the other night. Josh Crampton. Isaiah Dillinger. Don't get it for
Isaiah's
me?
on crutches.
All right. I'll come down and shake his hand in a minute. John Hill. Corey Jameson. So I ain't got Spurs on me. Michael Keys. Parker Martin. Cam Moats. Bradley Summers. O'Shane Thorpe.
Got hit.
Oh, in the hand. Oh, man. Let me do this. Kyle West. Coach Tony West. Oh, I knew this guy. Manager Steve Burke.
Thank you, bud. Appreciate it.
And business manager Randy Jameson. You want to say something? I mean, I know you never give up a chance.
Well, the only thing I'd like to say is fantastic group of boys. We've done this 2 years in a row now. Went through a lot of tournaments to get there, and we actually hope this year that we can bring a world championship back to Hagerstown. That's never happened for the Pony League. Colt League's done it twice, but Pony League's never done it. So if you can watch on Game Changer or I think ESPN3, our game's going to be televised, so you should be able to follow us.
It's Friday, 10 a.m.
No, it's we play Friday at 8 p.m. Okay, and then when we win, we won't play again until Monday at 5:30. All right, and thanks for everything. We appreciate it. If any of you are hungry or thirsty afterwards, it's Funds for Friends at the Green Turtle. They're giving us 20% of all the things that we get there. It only costs $4,500 a trip, and we've only sent 4 teams so far, and this makes 5, so we need all the help we can get. Thanks. All right. All right.
Good luck.
Thank you. Sure, let me get out of the way.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can go. Thanks again.
See you, Steve.
All right.
All right,
great.
city administrator's comments.
Nothing additional, Mr. Mayor.
Don?
No comments, Mayor.
Lou? Paul?
Oh, so you guys all passed, now I got something to say.
All right, Chris.
No, I got something here. Come on now, Mr. Mayor, after all that. National Night Out was last week, obviously we weren't here. Just wanted to thank Chief Brito if he's still here, and all the guys at HPD. Thought it was a great event of community partnership with the police department and the community. Following up on a couple of things we discussed tonight, and I think we'll get into more next week with the rental licensing. Thank you to Kathy and the code department. I had the privilege of doing a ride-along with code. She had put that invite out, I guess, a couple weeks ago. So last Friday, I rode around with Pam Harris. Had a great time as far as seeing a bunch of all kinds of different things from, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and sort of, everything in between. So again, I think we'll touch more on that probably when we get into rental licensing next week. But it was a great experience, and I appreciated them setting that up. So that's all I got.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Krista?
Just one thing, I attended the ESAC meeting with Chief Lohr the other evening. I think we continue to sort of press the issue of importance, the role that the city fire system plays within, the current county operation, and I think we'll continue to impress upon the group our concerns and our, goals to try and work with them to find resolution to the issues that the county faces.
All right, I also attended the National Night Out last week. Emily was there too. Great crowd, a lot of vendors, a lot of volunteers. So we appreciate that very much. It was a great time to be able to speak to people in the community about concerns and solutions, which we always like to hear. Other than that, I once again want to wish the Pony League All-Star team great success in Pennsylvania as they hopefully bring back a World Series championship. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor.